Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a very exciting video we're going over in advance of Tuesday's election results for the 2026 Texas U.S. Senate race, Democratic and Republican primaries. Now this is going to be very interesting. This has been a few months of buildup and it has gotten very competitive on both the Democrat and Republican sides in the last few weeks. So this should certainly be very, very interesting. So first things first, how we got here. We're going to start on the Republican side. This Senate seat is currently held by Republican incumbent Senator John Cornyn. Now, Cornyn entered into 2025 and now 2026 as someone that was potentially vulnerable to a Republican primary challenger. And this was from a lot of accusations of Republicans more loyal to President Trump calling John Cornyn a rhino, someone that breaks with Trump often and doesn't really side with the Make America Great Again wing of the Republican Party. By far the biggest critic of John Cornyn throughout this whole process has been the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who early on accused John Cornyn of being anti-Trump and launched a Senate bid to go after and try and primary out John Cornyn. So for a while, the matchup was John Cornyn versus Ken Paxton, and the early polling showed that Ken Paxton had a very strong chance and still does have a very strong chance at defeating Cornyn. However, things actually got a little bit wonkier though when Texas Representative Wesley Hunt announced a few months ago that he would be running for this race as well. Now Hunt, when he entered the race, he's been taking around 18 to 22% or so in most of these polls, which likely means this race will not be decided on election night, as Texas has a rule where the winning candidate in the primary must break 50% of the vote. If they do not, then there will be a runoff election of the top two vote getters. And Hunt getting such a significant amount of the vote will likely stop a runoff from happening. The question will be, will it be Cornyn, Paxton, or Hunt that advance to the runoff? Now, for no pun intended, but kind of pun intended, the president, Donald Trump, obviously, who is a Republican, who has been very vocal, usually with endorsing candidates in primaries and getting the candidates he wants to be the Republican candidates. On this one, President Trump has actually remained neutral so far in this primary, saying he likes all three of the Republicans running. Now, in terms of how that benefits each Republican, we'll have to wait and see. I personally think that it actually benefits Paxton, as if President Trump threw his support behind John Cornyn, a lot of those Republicans that are very pro-Trump but anti-John Cornyn maybe may soften their stance on that a little bit. But by not endorsing anyone, I think this boosts Paxton's chances of potentially winning in this primary. Now, for the polling averages for the Republicans right now, this three-way race is very competitive. In the race to the White House polling average in the latest numbers, Ken Paxton leads as of February 26th in the aggregate with 30.1%. John Cornyn is in second place with 27.6%. Wesley Hunt is in third at 19.9%. So an under 3-point race lead for Paxton over Cornyn with a lot of undecided vote across the average of all these polls. Roughly about 17% or so are still undecided as of today. So there's a lot of Republican voters who either have not made up their mind or who have made up their mind and are keeping it to themselves that can certainly sway this race one way or the other. But a very close one, according to Race to the White House. Decision Desk HQ, very popular political elections website online as well and social media as well. Very similar findings. They have Paxton leading 36.5, Cornyn's at 32.2, and Hunt is at 18. Real Clear Politics, 34% for Paxton, 29.4 for Cornyn, and 19.8 for Hunt. And 270 to win, the popular election website, 35.8 for Paxton, 30.3 for Cornyn, and Hunt at 20.8. So far, all these polls do have a few things in common. For one being that Ken Paxton is leading over John Cornyn in every single one of these polling averages. Heading into election night, that does suggest that Ken Paxton is the favorite and is more likely going to lead on election night, though there is a lot of undecided vote that ultimately can change that. Though it is also true that John Cornyn has been polling pretty consistently as the number 2 in this race. So if the numbers are correct and no candidate breaks 50% of the vote, the runoff election will likely feature Republican Senator John Cornyn going up against Ken Paxton. Wesley Hunt, though he is not within striking distance in these polls of getting into second or first place, there is enough undecided vote out there if he consolidated enough of it that he could maybe try and squeak in to one of those top 2 spots. But Hunt right now appears to be mainly playing spoiler in this race, but so far competitive race, most likely going to a runoff. Now, on the Democratic side, things are very interesting on the Democratic side because Democrats are feeling very optimistic in this Texas Senate race, especially if Ken Paxton is the Republican nominee. And I'll be getting into that more in just a few minutes. But this Senate race, Texas in 2018 had a very close Senate race for Ted Cruz versus Beto O'Rourke. Some of you that have been watching a lot of elections for a while now will remember that race. It was very close. It was an under 3-point victory for Ted Cruz over Beto O'Rourke in President Trump's first midterm in a Democratic wave year. So similar optics election-wise to what this midterm is supposed to be. And Democrats are hoping to make this race very close. Initially, the nominee from 2024 who ran against Ted Cruz, Colin Allred, entered this race, though he quickly dropped out of the race once State Representative James Talarico announced that he was running, and then also right around the same time that he dropped out, U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett announced a run as well. So for State Representative James Talarico, he's been known as a rising star among the Democrats in the state of Texas, and he really got a lot of heightened attention during the whole fiasco with the redistricting of the Texas House map, where Republicans were trying to gerrymander the map to get as many Republican seats as possible. Several of the state Democrat representatives, including Talarico, went on the news, went on social media, voiced their disagreement, fled the state, went to other states, and gave speeches talking about what was going on. He became a very popular name in American politics, especially in Democratic American politics, when he did that. As for U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett, she is someone that has been certainly no stranger to American politics and Democratic voters in the past year or so. Really, since President Trump has gotten elected, Crockett has been one of the most outspoken Trump critics in the U.S. Congress, and she has transferred that now into a Senate run in the state of Texas. And she is someone that is doing a very excellent job, based on the polling data, of getting a lot of hardcore Democrats, those Democrats that are not interested in sort of playing ball with independents and Republicans, the Democrats that are more progressive, more on the farther left of the party, that are very upset with President Trump. She is someone that appeals to those voters very, very strongly. Now, Talarico's strategy is more on the opposite of trying to win over Democrats, but also trying to win over independents and Republicans as well, and try and recreate the strategy that almost got Beto O'Rourke elected in 2018. And he is someone that has been able to appeal to a certain number of independents and Republicans as well. Well, Crockett's going more on the hammer the message, get as many Democratic voters out to vote as possible. It should be worth noting that Crockett is also got a very big endorsement in the last day or so, with the former Vice President Kamala Harris endorsing her in this race. So the national momentum and the polling momentum in the last few days or so has actually started to go towards Jasmine Crockett. Talarico seemed to be the favorite for the last month or so, but Crockett is certainly picking up steam now heading into the final few days of this race. As for the polling data on this one, I mean, there's no other thing to say than it's an absolute dead heat. This race is so close. Race to the White House has Jasmine Crockett at 45.3, Talarico 45.4. It's a tied race in that one. Decision Desk HQ 44.4 for Talarico, 44.1 for Crockett. Again, 0.3% lead, tied race. Vote Hub, very popular website as well for covering elections, 46.3 for Crockett, Talarico 43, a 3.3% lead. And 270 to win has Crockett leading by the largest margin of 49.5 to Talarico at 43. Now in this race, across the averages of this one, there's roughly about 9.9% that are still undecided, but this is a absolutely super close race in the Democratic primary between Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico. If the top two polling averages of Race to the White House and Decision Desk HQ end up being the more accurate of the two, where they're both at 44, they're both at 45, and then it's up to that remaining 10% or so to decide who's going to win this Democratic primary. This is going to be an absolute, no question, nail biter heading into election night, and how ultimately we're going to have to wait and see until all the votes are counted, because I'm expecting this to be a very close race. So what is overall at stake for this Senate race in Texas? Well, the 2026 Senate map has actually gotten very competitive rather quickly, where it started out looking like a map that was decently in favor of the Republicans, seeing that there was a lot of very close races up in Michigan, Georgia, and New Hampshire. But as things have changed, with President Trump's approval rating now falling to the low 40s and even high 30s, depending on what poll or polling average you're looking at, and the generic ballot for which party voters want to win, Democrats or Republicans, Democrats are polling anywhere from 3 to even 8 points in certain polls, the Democrats are now in a real striking position to make a significant run at taking the Senate in 2026. Now, they're still facing an uphill battle. The Republicans, given the terrain of the map, have the advantage, but there's a real possibility of a very close Senate map. The Democrats may be able to get to 50 seats. It would look something like this. The current composition is Republicans at 53, Democrats at 47. Now, there are 3 very close Senate races up that the Democrats are currently defending in Georgia, Michigan, and New Hampshire that the Democrats have to win to have any chance at taking the Senate. If they hold those 3 races, which as of right now, I would say they're favored to hold all 3, that would get the Democrats back to 47. Then the Democrats would have to go in the offensive. 2 Senate races that are being watched very closely are North Carolina and Maine. 2 Senate races that are essentially toss-ups between 2 Republican incumbents, one not running in Tom Tillis in North Carolina and Susan Collins in Maine. Both of those are very, very close. That could go to either party. If the Democrats hypothetically were to win those, that would get the Democrats up to 49 Senate seats. Republicans would then be at 51. Now, from there, the Democrats would have to win another Senate seat that's considered to be lean Republican at this current point in time. The first one that comes to mind is the state of Alaska, where Dan Sullivan is facing off against former Congresswoman Mary Peltola. Let's say hypothetically Peltola finds a way to win that race. The Senate is then divided 50-50, with the vice president breaking the tie in the Senate, so it's still in Republican control due to J.D. Vance being the Republican vice president. This is where a state like Texas comes into play. In the right scenario where there's a 50-50 Senate, if the Democrats could find a way against a weaker Republican opponent to win the state of Texas, then there could be a possibility the Democrats get 51 Senate seats, Republicans would then fall to 49. Now, a lot of things would have to go right for the Democrats for that to be the case, but it is indeed a possibility that that could happen. Now, as for the overall odds for this race, using Polymarket's latest odds, it shows on the Republican side, Ken Paxton is a very strong favorite to win at 78%, John Cornyn at 20%, Wesley Hunt only at 1.4. So the markets on this one certainly seem to show that Ken Paxton is the most likely Republican nominee. On the Democratic side, it's a lot closer, but James Talarico is leading over Jasmine Crockett 69-31. Even though the polls have shifted a little bit in Crockett's favor and direction, the markets still think Talarico is ultimately going to pull off the win in this race. Now, in a new feature for this election night that I have not used previously, I'm using the website Vote Hub, who they have put out the early vote numbers for the Democrat and Republican primaries. Now, for the 2026 Texas Democratic primary, the early vote numbers have been through the roof. Overall, 190% or 190.7% more voters than from the 2022 midterm primary on that one. There has been almost 1.2 million ballots cast on the Democratic side. And you can see on the map of Texas, the darker the blue, the more concentrated votes they are. There's a lot of them in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and the surrounding counties around that. That would be a very good sign for Jasmine Crockett, as that is where she is from, where her district is from, and that is where her core base of support is more likely going to come from. Where James Talarico from the Austin area is going to have his support be more around that Austin-San Antonio area of the state of Texas. So Democratic enthusiasm in this primary certainly seems to be through the roof compared to some of the past primaries in the last 8 to 10 years or so. On the Republican side, there also is a lot of significant ballots cast as well, with over 100% since 2022 at about 1 million ballots cast. Now, in this one, it's going to be a little different because there's pretty strong intensity throughout a lot of the state of Texas, including the Dallas area, but there's also some near San Antonio and going towards the southern border as well. Now, what's interesting with this one is since there's 3 candidates running, it's going to be a very tight race between the 3. So how this overall plays out, we're going to have to wait and see how that all goes. We do have a good idea that Houston is going to be a very strong area for Wesley Hunt. Dallas is going to be a stronger area for John Cornyn. Ken Paxton's probably going to do well right around the western part of the state, El Paso and San Antonio, and a lot of those more rural counties throughout Texas that are going to be a lot more pro-Republican, or pro-farther right Republican, like pro-MAGA Republican, is going to be the main area of support for Ken Paxton. Now, for some polling data, we do have an interesting general election poll from Emerson that I just briefly want to touch on. This poll was conducted from January 10th to 12th among 1,165 registered voters with a plus or minus margin of error of 2.8%. And this poll is John Cornyn versus James Talarico and John Cornyn versus Jasmine Crockett. Now in this one, Cornyn's leading Talarico by about 3 points and Crockett by about 5, with still 9% undecided. Now Cornyn does have the lead as the Republican incumbent, and I would expect him to win in these matchups, but these are still pretty decently sized, or pretty decently close rather, polls. Only a 3-point lead over Talarico and a 5-point lead over Crockett in the state of Texas, which is usually known for being a Republican stronghold, does give a little bit of optimism for the Democrats. But this isn't even the best part of the poll for the Democrats. When it's Ken Paxton's name thrown in the mix for Talarico versus Crockett, it's the same result either way. Talarico, Paxton tied at 46, Paxton, Crockett tied at 46. This is where the Democrats' optimism, which I mentioned earlier in the video, about facing off against Ken Paxton, while the Emerson poll, if it's an indicator, it's a tied race. Margin of error not even being factored into this conclusion, it is a tied race flat out between Paxton and Talarico, Paxton versus Crockett. And if it's a Democratic midterm year, Republicans, enough of them stay home, Democrats get out to vote. It's still a red state, Texas, so it's going to be hard for the Democrats to overcome that final hurdle and actually win. But the prospects of being an under 3-point race and the Democrats maybe pulling off an upset could be as real as they've ever been in the state of Texas in this scenario. Now here at 8 p.m. on Tuesday on Election Day, this is the Democratic map between Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico. 8 p.m. is when a lot of the polls in Texas do close. I do believe a certain part of Texas near the El Paso region, the polls do close at 9 p.m. But for 8 p.m. we're going to start getting a lot of the results to come in. And we're going to see the results come in a simulation of how I expect the election night to go for Jasmine Crockett versus James Talarico. Now, as the votes start to come in, Crockett's going to be in the darker blue color. James Talarico is going to be in the lighter blue color. We're going to see the map fill in, and we're going to have some of my results for how I expect Texas to look on the Democratic side. On the Republican side as well, Republican John Cornyn, Ken Paxton, and Wesley Hunt are all going to be facing off on the Republican side as well. Cornyn's going to be in the lighter red, or in the darker red color. Ken Paxton's going to be in the lighter red, almost pink color. Wesley Hunt is going to be in the darker purple fuchsia-like color on the map for this side as well. So with all that said, let's officially start getting to some of the results and how I think the election night is going to go down. And with that, without further ado, we're going to fast forward to about 9:35 p.m. This is about an hour and 35 minutes after the polls close for the 8 p.m. part of Texas, and about 35 minutes after the polls close for the El Paso part of Texas. And at this point in time, Jasmine Crockett has a lead over James Talarico of 58.2%, James Talarico 40.7%, and there's still roughly about 1 to 1.5% or so of voters that are voting third party or for the other candidates in this race. Now, why Jasmine Crockett has a massive lead at this point comes down to their bases of support. James Talarico, despite doing well in San Antonio and Austin, is going to do better in a lot of the smaller rural counties that will actually probably vote Republican in the general election, but in the primary, he's going to be the one to win those key areas. Whereas the vote coming out of Dallas-Fort Worth and out of the Houston area is going to be a lot early on of the strong Jasmine Crockett vote that has come in for her at this point in time. So a lot of the vote that's left out there, Talarico is probably going to win it and be in for a very close race. But the vote out of Dallas and out of Houston is going to come in very strongly for Jasmine Crockett, and is the reason why we're seeing such a big Jasmine Crockett lead at this current point in time. So roughly with about half the vote in on election night, I'm expecting Jasmine Crockett to have a pretty sizable lead if the votes come in this way, the way I think and I expect that they will. If they come in this way, Crockett should be leading at this current point of the night. On the Republican side, John Cornyn, much closer race going on here, only a 5-point lead between Cornyn, Ken Paxton, and then Wesley Hunt in the third. And sort of similar in a regard, Ken Paxton is going to be winning a lot of the small rural counties. John Cornyn is going to be doing very well in the Dallas-Fort Worth and Austin areas as well of the state. Wesley Hunt, however, he's going to be doing very strong in the Houston area. That is his district. That is his core base of support. and that's leading right now to a two-way race between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. Wesley Hunt getting 21.3% at this current point in time is certainly very strong and very formidable, but in this election is going to be very tough for him to try and get up into that second or first place spot that Cornyn and Paxton currently hold. So ultimately, we're going to see Cornyn and Paxton in all likelihood advance to the runoff election. Now here at 11:25 p.m., I am simulating that roughly about 3 hours or so after the 8 p.m. poll closings, a little past that, we're going to have a projection in this Senate race in Texas on the Democratic side that in a very closely fought matchup, Jasmine Crockett is going to end up the winner at 50.6%. James Talarico is going to fall just narrowly short at 48.4%. And what actual raw vote numbers will probably only be a difference of like 10,000 votes or so, maybe 20,000 votes, given how close this race is. And ultimately what it comes down to is that I think James Talarico is going to do very well. Like I said, in the western part of Texas and the smaller rural counties, there's just not as many people there as there is in the concentrated counties surrounding Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, these areas and the surrounding counties. With more people living in them, it's going to be a very close race as Talarico is winning more counties than Crockett, but the overall concentration of the voters breaking for Crockett just a little bit more than Talarico is going to end up a narrow victory for her in this race. And ultimately what I think it comes down to is the support Jasmine Crockett's been gaining nationally in the state of Texas in the last few weeks. As I mentioned, the polling gap, Talarico is leading by a pretty decent amount in the last few weeks or so. That has really started to close. And typically in a primary election, things can be very unpredictable, but usually the trends in the final few days and final few weeks can give a pretty decent indicator of how things are going. And I think the indicator for this race is that Jasmine Crockett has the enthusiasm edge, she has the national spotlight edge, and things are really starting to close and shape up. Now that being said, I think it's going to be a very, very close race that if Talarico pulled off the win, I would not be shocked. But I think Jasmine Crockett, given the endorsement by the former vice president, is going to have a little bit of an enthusiasm gap and narrowly defeats James Talarico in this race. While at the same time, some Democrats will be thrilled about this. Some Democrats, as seeing Talarico's percentage getting 48.4%, are going to be disappointed. They believe Talarico can win this race and Crockett likely can't, but this is going to keep this race very entertaining and very really one to watch for heading into November, as the Democrats hope to try and flip Texas. So very close matchup between Crockett and Talarico. I do narrowly give the edge to Crockett in this race. On the Republican side, not real surprise here. I've been kind of dropping this hint throughout the entire video that I expect it'll go to a runoff election with no candidate breaking 50% of the vote. It'll be Ken Paxton and John Cornyn facing off in the runoff election. Once all the votes are all in, I do ultimately predict that Ken Paxton will be in first place at 41.2%, Cornyn 38.4%, Wesley Hunt will finish around 18.4%, his numbers falling off a little bit once more undecided voters come in and they vote. I think we're going to see a lot of them break for either Paxton or Cornyn. I think Wesley Hunt's going to be in kind of a tough spot to try and stay competitive for that second spot. And ultimately, this has gone pretty much the way we expected, where Cornyn did well in Dallas-Fort Worth, Cornyn did well in the Austin area, and then Wesley Hunt did well around Houston, but Ken Paxton did well pretty much everywhere else, including some of the smaller counties surrounding Dallas and Fort Worth and Austin, where we saw on the Democratic side Crockett winning all of those and some rural counties. On this one, Paxton's winning all the rurals and some of those suburban counties surrounding these key metropolitan areas. So I think Paxton and Cornyn are going to advance to a runoff election. I'll have that in just a moment, how I think that's ultimately going to go. But a very close competitive runoff election is going to be taking place between the Texas Attorney General and the current U.S. Senator John Cornyn. And it's going to be a very interesting runoff because there's going to be a lot of Republicans very passionate about this one. A lot of Republicans who are probably going to be scared that John Cornyn could win this race, but Ken Paxton could be in danger of losing it, could make for a very competitive runoff. The question for John Cornyn is going to be, though, is there enough Republicans out there who are angry at him and don't like the job that he's doing that'd be willing to vote for Ken Paxton to ultimately decide we can't risk losing this race and are going to support him when everything is said and done? That's going to be the main question for the runoff. Now with that, we have the runoff election results. And in this runoff prediction, I have Ken Paxton defeating John Cornyn 54.2% to 45.8%. So my rationale here is this is a larger margin of victory than the current polls suggest, but it is a 3-person race where it's about a 3, 4, 5-point lead for Paxton over Cornyn. In a head-to-head matchup of Paxton versus Cornyn, I do think there are going to be a lot of Republicans, especially in the metropolitan areas like Dallas, like Austin, and their surrounding suburbs in Houston, that feel that Ken Paxton cannot win and are going to vote against him. While at the same time, there are so many Republicans in the state of Texas that want someone above all else that is a America First, MAGA, loyal Republican to Donald Trump, that will vote for everything Donald Trump wants, that'll be a vocal advocate for Donald Trump in a way that they feel that John Cornyn is ultimately not doing. So I think once the runoff takes place, Ken Paxton is going to win 54.2%, John Cornyn 45.8%, and honestly, a 9-point victory or so ends up being a lot closer than what a lot of the earlier runoff polls showed in this race, say a year ago, where it looked like Paxton was leading Cornyn by roughly 20 points, depending on the poll. A 9-point showing ends up being a lot closer than expected, but I do think, despite the fact Cornyn is the incumbent, we're going to see Ken Paxton ultimately take this Republican runoff and advance to the general election. Now, with that said, this means the general election for the 2026 Texas Senate race is set, and it's going to be a fascinating election, because you could argue with Ken Paxton facing off against Jasmine Crockett, in my prediction, these are the two candidates that certain skeptics of both of their parties are the two candidates that they're probably most worried about facing off. Paxton is the candidate that most Republicans feel will be off-putting and that Democrats may be able to capitalize on, while some Democrats are concerned that Jasmine Crockett may be the candidate that gives the Republicans the best chance of winning. So you sort of have like the unstoppable force, immovable object sort of facing off in this general election in the state of Texas. And if it were to happen, I'll say it right now, a lot of Republicans are probably going to be very optimistic about this race and think they can't lose. Ken Paxton's popularity issues, I think, are going to be a big concern. Crockett versus Paxton is going to be a very close race. One, I do ultimately think Paxton will win, but I don't think it's going to be by a massive margin. I think around a 5-point race or lower is going to be how it goes. I don't think the Republicans are out of the woods on this one. Just because Jasmine Crockett would win the Democratic primary, I think Crockett certainly could pull off a very close race. I don't know if she could pull off the upset, but I certainly don't think it's impossible, especially if Ken Paxton is leading the ticket for the Texas 2026 Senate race. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. I know I have taken a little bit of a break since my last video, but I'm going to be doing some more videos in the coming days and weeks as well, so make sure to keep an eye out for those. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave your thoughts down below. Who you think is going to win this primary, and who do you think is going to win the general election, and any other video ideas or topics you want to see me cover as well. Make sure to leave those all down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. This has been Election Night 2026 for the Texas U.S. Senate race primary.